Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at SIU Carbondale. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Illinois Authors. And we're delighted to be joined by an Illinois native, Dave Kindred, who is a legendary sports writer and is also the author of this terrific memoir called My Home Team, A Sports Writer's Life and the Redemptive Power of Small Town Girls Basketball. Came out last year, and it's a terrific book. Let me tell you a little bit about Dave. Dave is from Central Illinois, grew up in a town called Atlanta, Illinois, which is not too far from Bloomington and Peoria in Central Illinois there. He went to Illinois Wesleyan. When he was in college, he began working for the Bloomington newspaper, loved sports, played baseball at Wesleyan, and then went on to a career, started out as a writer for the Bloomington paper, then had opportunities in Louisville, the Washington Post, Atlanta, the Golf Digest, just some amazingly interesting and rich experiences. Wrote a number of books, including a book, kind of a joint biography of Howard Cosell and Muhammad Ali that is really reputed to be terrific. Dave has covered like all the major sporting events in the last, half century or so. Muhammad Ali, Tiger Woods, Michael Jordan, the Amazing Horse Secretariat, covered all the major sporting events, just a remarkably rich array of experiences. He's won about every award you can win or want to win as a sports writer, including three of the highest honors, the Red Smith Award, the PEN America ESPN Lifetime Achievement for Literary Sports Writing, and the Dan Jenkins Medal for Excellence in Sports Writing. He's also a member of the National Sports Media Hall of Fame. So he, and this book is just a wonderful insight into a kind of a new chapter in his life. So we're delighted that he's joining us from his home. So good morning, Dave.
Well, thank you, John. I thank you very much. I listened to all that, and it kind of makes me tired. It's like I should rest a little bit now.
Well,
That's not
let's tell everyone about these interesting
nature.
things. So you grew up in Central Illinois, small town Atlanta, about 1,300 people. Loved sports, loved writing. Went to Illinois Wesleyan on a scholarship, which involved playing some sports, but also you worked part-time for the Bloomington Panagraph. You wrote an essay actually to win the scholarship. So talk a little bit maybe just about the Illinois Wesleyan years and just kind of your dual love of sports itself and also writing, how that started.
Well, the whole thing with Illinois Wesleyan really started with reading, with being a sports fan. I was reading the Daily Panagraph. The Illinois Wesleyan baseball teams always were very good. I became interested in writing. I wrote for the high school newspaper, such as it was, a mimeograph 2-page thing. And the Daily Panagraph had an essay contest once, why you wanted to be a journalist. I entered the contest and was lucky enough to win it. The reward was that they paid half your tuition at Illinois Wesleyan, and you worked at the newspaper for the other half. So I did that for the 4 years I was at Wesleyan, while playing baseball, while courting the woman who would be my wife for 59 and a half years. And somewhere in there, I went to class once in a while. I played baseball for the coach, Jack Hornberger, and wrote for the Panagraph, wrote for the Illinois Wesleyan newspaper, and had a great time for 4 years. Stayed at the Panagraph for another 2 years. The Panagraph, I have to say, at that time was I would say, a great regional newspaper. 50,000 circulation, covered most of the counties around Central Illinois. Stuff that I learned there, both as a writer and as an editor, served me well for the next 50 years. It was a great training ground that unfortunately no longer exists in the newspaper world. Left there in 1965, came back to Illinois in 2010, after those 45 years that you just recorded there, and never really felt like I left. My wife and I both were Atlanta, Illinois people, and we always felt we were like on a great road trip and that someday we would come home. And we did that in 2010.
Right. Well, we're gonna take you home in just a little bit, but let's just talk a little bit about some of the highlights of your sports writing career because after you left the Bloomington paper, you worked for the Louisville paper, and relatively early on in your tenure there, one of your first assignments was a local boy by the name of Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, was in town, and you were assigned to track down Mr. Ali and see what he's up to. And then that began what became a really kind of a 50-year friendship association with him. And so talk about Muhammad Ali and just, your 50 years as an
Well,
analyst of Muhammad Ali.
well, early on, John, I decided that I could not be a big league baseball player. I think I decided that the first time I saw a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. So, ooh, I can't do that. But I thought that I could, it changed my attitude. I wanted to be a big time writer, big time sports writer. I had grown up reading various anthologies of sports writing, loved it all. And so from the Panagraph, I applied for every job that I could see. And magazine called Editor and Publisher had one ads at the back. I got a job in Louisville. I went there, took any job. It wasn't a writing job, it was an editor's job, a copy editor's job. So but the sports editor said, I know you want to be a writer, so anytime you want to write something, just let me know. So during the day, I worked the desk, as an editor at night, 5 to 1 shift. During the day, I would bring my son, who happened to be at that time 3 years old. I was Mr. Mom, Mr. Dad, maybe. I would take him with me to the Panagraph. I would take him with me to the Courier Journal sports department. I'd set him at a typewriter and let him play while I worked the phone trying to find a story. Well, one of those days, one of the bosses, everybody was my boss at that time. I was 23 years old. One of the bosses came in and said, "Clay's in town. Go find him." At that time, the Courier Journal still called Cassius Clay Clay. The writing would be Clay, comma, also known as Muhammad Ali. The newspaper had not yet acknowledged that he had changed his name. By then, he was 2 years the heavyweight champion of the world. So I had no idea how to find Cassius Clay in Louisville, except I knew that his father ran an art gallery like 2 blocks away from the newspaper. So I went to his father, Cassius Clay Sr., and asked him, where's Cassius? And he just pointed to the west end of Louisville. He's out there somewhere. So I just got in the car with my son, drove out there somewhere, and started asking people, anybody seen Cassius? Everybody had seen Cassius because he was in town. He was celebrating himself, as he often did. So I found him, put him in the car with me and my son. We drove around to all the places he wanted to show me. The most famous of those places, the one I best remember, was a telephone pole. I said, okay. He said, well, that's the telephone pole that Joe Louis leaned against once. So, okay, I wrote that down. I wrote a story that day that was in October of '66. That was the first time that I met him. I wrote about him then for the next almost 50 years, constantly. I went to 17 of his fights, 10 of them were championship fights. I got to know him in every situation, everywhere, and knew that I had to write a book about Ali. The strange thing, John, was that at that time, I'm talking now about early 2000, nobody wanted a book about Muhammad Ali because he was still kind of the arc of the book is that he went from reviled to revered.
Mm.
But at that time, he was more reviled than revered. My publisher, my editor, my agent could not find a place to place this book. So I then I thought about it for a couple of years, and then I put Ali and Howard Cosell together because in my mind they were often together, and did the book that way. And I wrote that book with, I don't know how many writers work, but I had grand ideas, grand hopes for that book. I wanted to write a book that 50 years from then, people could pick it up and say, oh, that's who Ali was. So that was my aim with that book. Cosell's presence made it sellable.
Gotcha.
But I very proud of that book.
Well, Dave, I want to read one column you wrote, which was as near the end of Ali's career, and he fought a gentleman by the name of Trevor Berbick, and who was kind of a journeyman fighter, and Ali lost. And you began the column by saying Muhammad Ali, 5 weeks short of his 40th birthday, lost tonight to the invisible opponent who is undefeated now and always. And then you quote Ali, "I couldn't beat Father Time," Ali said. "This is it." Um, and I guess one of the features of Ali was just, he kind of hung around a long, long time. Obviously made money, but also got hurt very badly, and towards the end was in pretty bad shape as his final years unfolded.
There's no, it was very sad to see, John. Well, let me say one thing about that column that you quote. I'm kind of proud of that column as a newspaper person because the fight was in Bermuda on a makeshift ring set up on a little league baseball field. They had no bell at ringside, so they went into a field and took a bell off a cow, literally a cowbell.
Wow.
And used a cowbell at the end of each round. It was kind of a dull sounding bell. And because the fight was, it was late, I don't know what time it was, I had to dictate that column. I didn't write that column. I just did that column off the top of my head, from a phone inside a shack next to what passed for, quote, a dressing room for Ali. I dictated, 600, 700 words on the fly at 1 a.m. But yeah, you could see Ali's deterioration. Before that, he had lost a championship fight to Larry Holmes in Las Vegas, which was the saddest event that I'd ever, because if you're with somebody for maybe 40 or 50 years and you've seen them when Ali was the greatest athlete that I ever saw, the greatest athlete I ever expect to see. 6'3", 215, 220, fast, strong, courageous, everything that you would want in an athlete. And when you see the diminution, when you see the deterioration even of that athlete, that he refuses because that's who he was. He refused to acknowledge that he was no longer the fighter that he once was. And you see him beat badly by Larry Holmes. You see him lay out for a year, and he still can't go away. So the Trevor Berbick fight was a year after that one. Ali thought that he could come back, but he couldn't. He was a journeyman, worse than a journeyman against Berbick. So it was very sad to see. The next day, though, Ali, still being the imp that he always was, did a press conference. And at the end of the press conference, he said, "I shall return to Los Angeles." He was done. He finally admitted he was done.
Yeah. Well, Dave, you had we won't talk about your full career because it's so interesting and so many twists and turns, but you worked for the Washington Post at a time when they just had some of the great reporters in the history of American journalism. Ben Bradley was a managing editor, Bob Woodward, John Feinstein was I think a more junior columnist, Tom Boswell, David Marinis, David Remnick, etc. And so you're talking about your life as a columnist, and you describe it as being the most exclusive club in the United States, even little, or someone I guess referred to it as even more exclusive than the U.S. Senate. But just let's talk a little bit about the life of a sports columnist, because as you trace it in your book, I mean, it had kind of a seasonal flow. You would begin, watching the college bowl games and late December, January, and then the Super Bowl, and then college finals and basketball, and the Masters and Indy 500 and World Series, and just the whole flow of it. But I want to read one sentence and just have you reflect. You're talking about just the kind of the fun of being a columnist and the good fortune. You said, if not for that astonishing good luck, how else could a kid from the Illinois cornfields wind up in the press gallery of Wimbledon Center Court, close enough to the royal box that he could study the aquiline profile of Princess Diana and write, quite the babe. Um, Talk about the life as a columnist and just what that was like.
Well, you've well described it there. It was at the beginning of each year, I could basically tell you where I was going to be every 2 weeks for that year. And I led that life. Every major sports event, I was at every major sports event for maybe 20 years, beginning in January and ending in December. The travel was tiring, but I looked forward to it. I wanted to, I mean, it was that life no longer exists. I think you described the life of a journalistic dinosaur, because sports columnists, among all newspaper people, are a dying breed. The entire. I was so happy, so lucky to be in newspapers at a time when newspapers were ambitious. Not only ambitious, but they were very good and had money to spend. You could go everywhere and do everything. I was 15 years old when my mother gave me a typewriter that she had bought for $5 at an auction. And I sat at our kitchen table in Atlanta, Illinois. I wanted to remember, I did this, you realize these things later, but I wanted to remember the first words I ever typed. Well, why would I want to remember those first words? Because I was going to be a sports writer. I guess I decided then that's what I wanted to do. So the first words I ever typed were Stanley Frank Musial, who was that was 1956, great St. Louis Cardinals baseball player. So I kind of decided then that's what I wanted to do. How many people, John, are so lucky that they decide at 15 what they want to do, how they want to do it, and they get to do it for 60 years. And it was like, I got to do and work for a great newspapers. The Louisville Courier-Journal was one of the top 10 newspapers in the country when I worked there. The Washington Post was the top newspaper. Right after Watergate, Woodward and Bernstein were stars. Bradley was a star. I became a sports columnist, one of two sports columnists there. And it made my life. It made my life possible, a charmed life, it could be called, because it was the answer to all of my dreams, answer to all of my ambitions. And I got to do it at a high level at very good newspapers for a very long time. And that possibility doesn't exist today.
Right. Well, Dave, you, as your book describes, just you and your wife Cheryl moved back to Illinois around 2010, and back to Central Illinois. And through just some fortuity, you had a friend whose daughter played on the high school basketball team, the Morton High School basketball team. You and Cheryl went to a game, loved it, and you decided to volunteer to be their correspondent. The only financial consideration was I think a box of Milk Duds for every game. and then began this wonderful experience. And I want to just read a couple sentences because the thing that struck me as you're talking about, deciding to cover the Morton Potters was just kind of the simplicity of sport. And I want to read a couple sentences and maybe have you reflect on it. And you were saying the games would be pure and simple, 4 8-minute quarters, no halftime shows, no media timeouts, no commercials, and no video boards demanding we get loud. After games, we'd stand around on court trading small talk with friends before driving the half-hour home, first stopping McDonald's for ice cream, and then at home at the typing machine, I would begin again. So talk about just the returning to Central Illinois and just your embracing of the Lady Potters.
Well, I've done that for 14 years now. We came back, had a friend whose daughter, Carly Crocker, played on the girls' high school team. I had never seen a girls' high school basketball game. Actually, I had seen one in 1975 somewhere in Western Kentucky. Had not seen another one until 2010 in Morton. I went to the game, had no intention of writing, but I discovered that, like the old warhorse, I couldn't be at a game and not want to write about it. I had discovered that at Broadway shows in New York. I'd go to the show and I'd watch Man of La Mancha and I'd want to go backstage and interview Rich Hiley afterward. That wasn't allowed. But at a girls' high school basketball game, I figured I could do whatever I wanted to do. I found a father ran a website for the girls' basketball team, Dave Byrne. So I went to Byrne after a game and asked if I could write for him. Well, he looked at me and he later said that this disheveled old man came out of the stands and wanted to write for me. I said, well, that's not exactly the way I would describe myself, but okay. And after a while, I convinced him that I could spell and type. He had no idea that I had ever done anything. And eventually I wrote for him and wrote for him every day, every game. And now 14 years later, I actually have been to more Morton Lady Potters games than the coach, who has been there for 25 years, because he missed some games during COVID, missed some games for funerals and weddings. I missed 4 games in 14 years, and eventually I told Dave Byrne, look, I'm a professional sports writer. I've been a professional sports writer for 50 years. I should be getting something for this. So as I say in the book, I believe that he considered my experience and my talent and my good looks and decided that he should pay me a box of Milk Duds every game. So over the years now, I've collected maybe 40,000 calories worth of Milk Duds, and I've enjoyed it all. I'm a writer. Writers write. I had things I wanted to say. It was a new experience for me, and by now I've written 500,000 words on that girls' basketball team, because they turned out to be very good. I had no idea if they were any good or not until suddenly they were winning 30 games a year. They won 4 state championships while I was there, second in another one, lost that state championship on the last shot. They were 37-1 that year. And I not discovered, but should have known, the girls were just as ambitious, just as dedicated and committed to being good at what they were doing as boys. The difference is just physical. The boys are quicker, stronger, faster. The girls have to be better at fundamentals. I've quoted John Wooden on women's basketball, that what the men can accomplish by their strength and size, the girls may take 3 passes to do it. Well, that's the game I grew up playing, 70 years ago, 60 years ago. That's the basketball game that I understood. There's no dunking, there's no flash, there's no flair. They're just very good They're good at basketball. So I enjoyed that and have enjoyed it. And about 5 hours after we finish this talk today, I will be on the road driving 100 miles to watch the Lady Potters begin regional play tonight.
Well, Dave, one thing that just jumps out in your book is just with the Lady Potters, just the culture of excellence that permeates this team. And I want to read a couple sentences you wrote and maybe have you reflect on it. You say, sometimes you see something done so well, you just laugh. You are so happy to be in the presence of excellence. You laugh at how good it feels to be there, to be alive, to see that things done better, to see that thing done better than you could imagine it being done. Then you want to say basketball is beautiful when people move the ball quickly and surely to places where it can be put in a basket easily. It's beautiful too when people play defense as if it's the most fun a teenage girl can have. So let's talk a little bit about just a culture of excellence that kind of permeates the Lady Potters, and it emanates, I think, from the coach, Coach Becker, who has kind of patented the term kind of humble swagger. So talk about just this culture of excellence that this school has built.
Well, that's a good term for that. Becker was a high school athlete in Sycamore, Illinois, northern Illinois, about 125 miles north of Morton. He went to the University of Illinois. He'd been a basketball player, a shortstop in baseball. I identified with him a lot. Uh, he had he took the job in Morton as an assistant coach in football and in baseball and in basketball. He wanted to be a coach. Eventually, the girls' job opened up. He became a coach. The first girls' basketball game he ever saw, he coached in. That was 25 years ago. Now, I don't know how it is other places. All I know is Morton. He's been here 25 seasons now. The other 7 teams in the league that they're in, Mid-Illini Conference, those girls basketball coaches, 7 of them have a total of maybe 17 years. So he's been here forever. He's put his stamp of excellence on this program. They have a youth program here that's very good. Girls grow up in Morton, one high school in town, 17,000 population. Girls who are athletes grow up wanting to be Lady Potters. So he's got this farm system that sustains the excellence. But what is, and I'm very, I haven't read this book that you just quoted. I wrote it. I'm very bad at going back and rereading it. But those sentences that you read are very good and describe very well what I feel about this program. And it's kind of things that I would never have written, say, about Michael Jordan's teams or about great college basketball teams, because it's a different viewpoint. I write differently about the girls' basketball team than I've ever written about anything. So it's not beneath me. I'm trying to raise my level of knowledge of basketball to where I can understand what's happening when I see them go 33-3 and 33-3 and 34-2 for a 7-year period there when they were very good, and they're still good, but they're not state championship level again yet. For 7 years there, they were 201-14. That was at a time when the Golden State Warriors were thought to be the very best basketball team ever created, with Steph Curry. And so I wrote a line one time saying that these girls, the Morton Lady Potters, are the Golden State Warriors with ponytails. Even the Golden State Warriors didn't have a record like that. 201-14. That's an average of 33 wins a year and 3 losses a year. And they were dominant. It was always fun to watch. It was experience to me that I felt a little guilt after having been a big time sports writer for 50 years without ever really doing right by Title IX. that gave women the same rights in athletics that boys and men do. So my time writing about the Lady Potters is kind of like atonement, paying back, recognizing at last what I should have recognized when Title IX passed in 1972. And I had never done that. And I think that time changed. I think more media pays more attention now to women's basketball, girls basketball than ever. And I'm very happy to be a very small kind of milk duds part of that.
Well, Dave, one thing that struck me too in your book, this was you get a sense of just the personality of these young ladies. And there was just one moment where they lost the state championship, I believe, as you mentioned earlier, by one basket. So they've been undefeated. It was this crushing defeat. They had a rally the next day. And they had one girl who spoke for the team. And, here she is, the huge disappointment. I mean, she's fighting back tears, but gives one of the most eloquent tributes, thanking the community for supporting them, the coaches, the family. It was just, I mean, one of the most gracious statements I think I've read in a long time, and thinking, man, a program that could produce someone who, and families, obviously produce these people too, who could comport themselves with such dignity and honor. And what must have been a crushing moment for her was just really, really striking.
That young lady was Olivia Rimmert. Excuse me, but I'm so happy. You're doing a great job, John, of picking out lines that I remember writing, but I haven't read. And that line causes emotion in me because Olivia Rimmert Olivia Rimmert was a 4-year player. As a freshman, one of the coaches had identified her as a potential great defender. She's a freshman. She's not, for 4 years, she's maybe the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th player on the bench, but she's always there. And she's always like a teammate. Again, I never saw that in men and boys athletics where the 12th guy on the team felt that he was as important as the first guy on the team. Olivia Rimmert, Bob Becker, the coach, had a wife who was an HR person, had 2 daughters who played for him. He learned to coach. He learned what it took to coach girls. It's different. He one time said to me, if a boy goes 1 for 10 in a game, he thinks he's Michael Jordan. If a girl goes 10 for 10, she thinks that 10 for 15, she thinks that she needs to come to the gym and shoot 500 shots tomorrow. So Olivia Rimmert grew up in that culture. She was part of that team. Olivia Rimmert was not a starter on that team until the championship game when they're 37-0. 37-0, they need to beat Chicago Simeon to win their 5th state championship in 6 years. Nobody's ever done that. Olivia Rimmert becomes a starter in that game because 2 other people, starters, had been injured. Olivia Rimmert's job in that game is to guard the best player in all of Illinois, a 6'2" Chicago Simeon player who's averaging 28 points a game. Olivia Rimmert may have averaged 0.3 points a game for her entire career. Her job is to play defense against this girl. Don't let her out of your sight. Don't let her breathe down her throat. She did that for 32 minutes. The girl averaging 28 points a game scored 8 points in that game. Morton lost on the last shot of the game. And so Olivia is, because she's Olivia, she's a bright student, a great student. She had in mind being some kind of biochemist, some kind of ridiculous
some kind of ridiculous job. I can't even pronounce what it was, but that's what she wanted to be in college. So the coach chooses her to make this speech that you talk about. And I'm proud that you read that. I'm proud that I wrote that because it took a lot of work. She'd made the speech in a gymnasium. I couldn't hear it well. The sound was reverberating. I couldn't understand what she said. So it took me like two months to find a recording of that speech because I knew that it was big and I wanted it in the book. So it took me 2 months to find it. So, and then to use it in the book the way that it was possible to use it with that whole backstory makes it, I'm so happy that you landed on that and understood the significance of that. Because that, to me, was the ultimate representation of what Bob Becker and the Morton High School has been able to accomplish with girls basketball. And that's,
Yeah,
and,
it was.
well,
It was really powerful to read. Well, Dave, there are many aspects of your book that I love, but one is just your wonderful evocation of Illinois, particularly, Illinois this time of year. And I want to read a few sentences. If anyone's in Hawaii watching us and saying, gosh, I wonder what it's like in Illinois in February, let me read a few sentences from you. The context is you're going to a super sectional game, I think an hour and a half or so north of Peoria off of Interstate 40. And you say, it was a scenic ride if you like your scenery in 50 shades of brown. Along that stretch of 40 in late February, there is nothing but brown grass and brown dirt and silos and grain elevators and trees that look like witches' arthritic fingers. We saw Singing Birch Road, Hillock Hollow Road, and the Merkle Ridge U-Cut Christmas Tree Farm. Signs pointed to Wyoming and Sparland and Ocella. In Bradford, we passed a home flying a Marine Corps flag. We passed 3 cemeteries. We straddled a dead skunk. We saw a 38 Packard in a barn lot. The Potter's trainer, Katie Garvin, once shouted, "Turkeys, 2 in that field." In terms of just evoking the state and again, I think just sort of the community that embraced this team and the culture around it. I mean, it just did an extraordinary portrayal, I think, of sort of Illinois at its best.
well, that was a trip to, I think, a little place called Manlius, which was just out in the middle of nowhere up there. And I again, that's the kind of stuff that I would never have written for the Washington Post. I may have written something like that, but I never wrote it with the feeling that this is home. I'll still remember in 2010 when we first came back to Illinois. We had lived in Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, and we came back to Illinois. Cheryl, my wife's mother, was with us in the car. We were driving from St. Louis north to Morton. And maybe 45 minutes north of St. Louis, Cheryl's mother, who had grown up in Atlanta, grown up on a farm in Atlanta, looks out the window and says, "Look, isn't that beautiful?" And I look out the window and I say, "What?" She says, "Don't you see that silo out there? It's just beautiful." I'm thinking, no. Okay, I see a silo, but it never occurred to me that it was beautiful. But now that what you've read was prompted by that moment. Yes, it's beautiful. By then I had been here for 7 or 8 years. I was on a charter bus with the team. When you got to the super sectional level, the state of Illinois let you rent a charter bus instead of the yellow school bus. So it was a comfortable bus. It was a great ride, and I just enjoyed it. And what you've read, I hope is timeless. Really my underlying ambition for all of this, really, everything I've written about the girls' basketball team, my underlying ambition was for their children to read this someday and know what mom did or know what grandma did even, because some of these girls now are mothers, so that was always my unstated feeling for that. It was more important. It was, it was happy. I'm happy that they were very good while I was there. But if they had been a 500 team, I think I'd have had just as much fun with it. I'd have found the same kind of great human stories with a team that was 500. And that goes on for a whole lot of schools in a whole lot of places like Manlius and Morton and, Bartonville and all of those places. Going to Galesburg. Yeah, I've been to Galesburg, 14 straight years now. Probably, it's 100 miles from here. I've gone in snow and ice. The weather today is beautiful. It's almost like springtime in Illinois right now, but I will enjoy going there again. And I'm 82 years old, John, and I have no ambition. I have no plan to quit doing this until I just can't do it. And right now I can do it and I still enjoy doing it. And all of that bus ride that you chose there is the reason why. I mean, it's just, I'm not sure exactly why it is. It's, 60 Minutes did a piece on me, and the voice, the reporter, John Wertheim, called it the flatlands of Illinois, the flat abs of Illinois. And that is what it is. It's flatlands. And I've grown to like those silos on the horizon.
Dave, we have a couple of questions that have been emailed in, and one comes from someone who asks, has there ever been a time, in your opinion, when sports and politics were so entwined? Is this a good thing or bad thing in your opinion? Now, I might just add parenthetically, in your book, you talk about, some of your experiences, including covering the 72 Olympics, in which there was that horrific terrorist attack in which you were able to, you saw just what was unfolding. So, I mean, but talk more broadly about the kind of connection between sports and politics and culture in American life.
Well, I think it's all intertwined. I think sports is as important a part of life as music is, as art is. I think it's all creativity. I've been accused many times of bringing politics into sports too much, and I probably am guilty of that. But I was a political science minor at Illinois Wesleyan. I pay attention to politics. I think politics is important. If I hadn't been a sports writer, I'd been a political writer. So I try to pay attention to what's going on around me. I don't necessarily like it when politics gets in really entwined with it. I don't like it when politicians attach themselves to a team in hopes that team's glory will reflect on them. But I don't think you can ignore it, and certainly in Munich, you couldn't ignore it. It was there. It becomes an attractive target, But at the same time, I want to keep sports out of politics. I want to keep politics out of sports. I think it really has no place in it. But it's complicated. I've lost friends, during this last presidential election, during COVID. I wrote 327 straight days during the pandemic on Facebook mostly about sports, but occasionally I would slip off into politics, and my politics are not necessarily the politics of people in central Illinois. And so it was not always a happy readership there.
Well, Dave, one thing
I try to avoid it. But sometimes I just find it unavoidable. And I think if you have a public voice, and my voice on Facebook became public because I'd written so much about the girls' basketball team, and I'd established myself as a very, very minor voice on Facebook. But I couldn't resist saying what I thought was obvious. Of course, what was
Right.
obvious to me was not obvious to most of the voters in Illinois.
Well, Dave, one thing that you make a point of it, you're describing, I mean, your time as a sports writer, and you said that you always viewed your calling is not to, to sort of render knee-jerk opinions, but to just to understand and try to understand someone in their full complexity. And you talk about a piece, I guess you did on Bobby Knight, and of course, it's easy to vilify him and to point out some of his outrageous behavior in public. But you saw it as your mission more to try to figure out what made the man tick. I mean, talk about that.
Well, I'm famous among my friends and sports writers for having this collection of rogues that I seem to enjoy writing about. Bobby Knight was at the top of that list. Ali, for that matter, was on that list. Ali did everything. Ali talked about race, religion, and politics. Everything you're not supposed to talk about. He talked about it all the time. John Thompson, at the coach at Georgetown in D.C., was he thought that politics was important, and he thought that he needed to create a culture in which his players participated in politics. I liked the rogues. I liked to understand what made them different. I liked Knight. I liked all the time. I mean, I say I liked the outrageous behavior, as you call it, was inexcusable, but it was part of him. It was really part of him. And I wanted to understand how somebody who could be so gifted as a teacher. I did a long piece on him for the Washington Post once, where I quoted a professor of Russian at Indiana, at IU, who came to his practices. This professor of Russian history came to Knight's practices at Indiana University because he thought that Knight was the best teacher in the university. What Knight taught his players in the sense of complex strategy, fundamental athletic moves, what he taught his players was taught so well that they could put it to use. And this professor of Russian history hoped that his students learned from him as well as Knight's students learned from him. So I wanted people to understand that he was more than this outrageous behavior guy, like more than the guy that just threw a chair, more than that guy. And it was a heavy burden to carry for a long time. And I'm not sure I ever carried it as successfully as I wanted to. But I thought that he was a great person who had some kind of mental problem, some kind of psychological problem. That certainly was beyond my reach, beyond anybody's reach. If he could have solved it, he would have solved it. But I think it was a kind of a father. All of his heroes, all of Knight's heroes were older coaches. They were all people that he respected growing up. Almost like me, like my sports writing idol was Red Smith. Red Smith was 25 years older than me. I was attracted to older people who had experienced what I wanted to experience. And I think that was the way Knight led his life. And certainly he came from an authoritarian time. Vince Lombardi, if any NFL coach today tried to coach the way Lombardi did, he'd be a pariah. It was a different time. In Knight's childhood, the great coaches were authoritarians, dictators. You did what they told you to do. Times changed under Knight, and Knight didn't change with those times.
Dave, we have another question that's been emailed in, and it was someone who must have seen an interview you did online, which I also saw. But he said, would Dave please discuss his most admired people qualities? And he cites perseverance, honesty, fairness, dignity, and humor. I saw an online where you were asked about what qualities you admired. So if you'd like to respond to that.
Well, I do admire those qualities. I'm not sure that I could see those in any one person, but I like to see those in a lot of people. You know, I don't. That's a good question. I wish I had. If you had given me that question yesterday, I might have been able to come up with a person. I'm not sure, but I think that at the end there, humor. I mean, that's the thing that, you know, Knight. Go back to Bob Knight. He had all that other stuff, but he had no sense of humor for sure. You know, what he thought was funny, other people thought was kind of, ooh, well, how could anybody say that? You know, he had no sense of humor, but I think sense of humor is important in all things. And certainly I try to do it in writing, and I admire it in people who are in pressure situations who can relieve it with a Dale Brown, who was a coach at LSU, basketball coach at Louisiana State, uh, was a great example of all that, probably. And he had a great sense of humor all the time. I mean, like his idea, he hated Bob Knight. He literally hated Bobby Knight. And his ambition, Dale Brown once said to me, his ambition was to get naked with Bob Knight and lock us in a room and see who comes out alive. Well, that I don't even want to imagine that picture, but he could say it with a sense of humor.
Dave, let's talk for a couple minutes about just we talked about it briefly before, but just more about just the world of sports writing. And it seems like there's kind of a paradox in the sense that it seems like interest in sport in the United States is as high as it's ever been. The supply of sport is enormous. I mean, surf channels on a Saturday in February, you can watch dozens and dozens of basketball games, and in the fall, football, et cetera. So, interest is all time high, demand is all time high, and yet the sports writing industry has contracted so dramatically. Obviously, it's linked to the struggles of newspapers and magazines. But talk about, but just is there some place where some sort of stable ground where we still will be able to be getting, sports writers who can chronicle sports and tell stories. And just separately, and maybe you can respond in a broad way about this. There's another thing that's going on that strikes me, which is kind of the explosion of punditry, particularly like on ESPN, in which, the week or two before the Super Bowl Classic, where you have panel after panel, entirely focused on predicting the future, having the most kind of, outrageous, perspective. So if you could combine all that and take as much time as you want, but just sort of the decline in sports writing as a profession, just because of opportunities and the explosion of kind of sports punditry, particularly on the cable TV stations.
Well, no reason that you should have noticed, but for the last 50 years, I've avoided being on television as much as I could. I was never a shouter. I was never able to. I took speech class at Illinois Wesleyan and pretty much failed it. I was too shy to speak out loud, and I have that nature still now. There's no way that I could be, to name anybody, Stephen A. Smith on ESPN, who is the absolute reverse of what I think any sports journalist should be. He's a shouter. Howard Cosell was his idol. And part of the problem in doing the book on Ali and Cosell, I made the point, and I believe it still, is that every fighter ever wanted to be Ali, tried to copy Ali. Every sports broadcaster wanted to be Cosell, wanted to copy Cosell. They were the one and only. There's never going to be another Ali. There'll never be another Cosell. So just quit it. But all those pundits that you talked about shouting, who can shout the loudest about their opinion? I don't care about their opinion.
I don't care about their opinion at all. And I certainly don't care about their opinion for 2 weeks before a game. I used to watch that stuff and I quit watching it because it makes no sense at all. Nobody is going to be able to say that Kansas City is going to win 26-22 in overtime. Instead, they just float a million ideas. I don't like it. The death of sports writing has been predicted for at least 40 years. I can remember reading a learned essay called "The Death of Sports Writing" by a sports writer in one of the literate magazines. Even when I was thinking that I was in the golden age of sports writing, it was predicted to be dying, that sports writers don't care about real sports anymore, whatever. Newspapers have died. Newspapers are zombies. They're dead people. They're dead newspapers walking. So there's no great writing, very little great sports writing in newspapers anymore, because newspapers have lost their money, lost their ambition. They've lost the financial ability to do what my life was. The Daily Pantograph, which I described as a great regional newspaper when I worked there, now has one sports writer. They have one person in the sports department. The paper is produced someplace else, like in Indiana or Northern Illinois or something. A game that one sports writer covers on a Tuesday night may appear in the newspaper Thursday. There's no newspapers have, but that's not to say, John, that there's not great sports writing going on. You have to search to find it. ESPN still does great sports writing. They have great sports writers. A website called The Athletic does great sports writing. Maybe even too granular for me. They get into the weeds of the craft of basketball and football more than I ever did. But it's very good, and it's all very literate. The Athletic, which is now basically the sports department of the New York Times. The New York Times now has no sports department of its own. What they run in the newspaper is produced by The Athletic. Yes, the New York Times owns The Athletic, but it's not the same as sports writers, as a guy who's showing up and saying, "Hi, I'm Joe Dokes from the New York Times." That sports writer doesn't exist anymore. But The Athletic exists, ESPN exists. There are websites where you can find very good sports writing, but not in very many newspapers anymore.
Right. I mean, Dave, I think the one thing that there's been a kind of a explosion. I mean, some really positive developments, I think, in the world of sports documentaries. I think ESPN has a 30/30. I think that's what it's called, where, I've seen some just terrific documentaries, which are really good at telling interesting stories that maybe, back in the day, Sports Illustrated might have chronicled.
Well, that's another death that we mourn. Sports Illustrated died maybe 10 years ago, literally died last week. But if I were a young journalist now, if I were a young person who wanted to document sports, I would not be a sports writer. If I were 20 years old now, I would want to be a documentarian. I agree with you. The ESPN's 30 for 30 is a very good thing, has been. I appeared in some of those, and what they did was great work always. And it was done with a journalistic integrity, a journalistic search for the truth. They were very good. Some of those, there's a documentary on Michael Jordan that I didn't like. I didn't watch any of it. 8 pieces. I saw what it was. It was a self-glorification of Jordan. But ones that are done editorially independent, as most of those 30/30s were, are very good. And I like those, and they tell stories. I mean, the way that I wrote I wanted it to be, I wanted the reader to see what I was talking about cinematically, and that's what documentaries are able to do. What Ken Burns does, I would love to be able to do that. I don't know enough about the documentary process to do that now, but I would love to be involved in producing a documentary. You could do a great documentary about the Morton Lady Potters, just that, define that culture. I mean, I learned this a long time ago that I made not a mistake, but because I loved my life. I loved writing. I loved the feel of the typewriter. I loved all of that. But in Louisville, there was a football coach named Lee Corso. You know Lee Corso now because he's been on television for the last 30 years. When Corso was a young football coach at the University of Louisville, I wrote about him because he was fascinating. I was a young guy. He was a young guy. I kind of hitched my wagon to him. He's going to be a great story every day. He's going to do something every day that's going to be fun to write about. So I wrote about him as often as I could. He was funny. Thanksgiving Day game in Tulsa, Oklahoma, he went out for the coin flip with a turkey on a leash. In Louisville one time, homecoming parade. He rode an elephant in the homecoming parade. Corso was always doing something that was fun, that was fun to write about. My point is, after doing this for 3 or 4 years, the local TV station did a 30-minute special on Corso. And for the next couple weeks, people would come up to me and say, I never knew Corso was that kind of guy. And I'm thinking, I've been writing about him for the last 3 years every time I could. And and now you saw him on TV and now you know who he is. Okay, I get it. And so I understand the power of television. It's a power that can't be defeated by the written word. I believe in the written word, but a lot of people would rather sit in front of their TV and watch it. It's easier. And if I were starting today, if I was 20 years old and ambitious, I would want to do documentaries.
Right.
So if there's anybody out there who wants to hire an 80-year-old guy to do documentaries, I'm still able to learn to do things.
Well, Dave, just finally, I know you're continuing to follow the Lady Potters. You're heading there this evening for a game, but I also understand that you're working on a biography of Stan Musial, and I know that you had said one of the first names you typed was Stan Musial. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's not a biography because a biography would be 4 or 5 years of work, and I don't want to do that. What I've decided to do is I do want to do a book in which Musial is the main character, but I'm going to do it about the 1946 St. Louis Cardinals season, year after World War II ends. America is happy. The St. Louis Cardinals at that time they are the Yankees of the National League. They had won they'd won World Series in 42, 43, 44, 45. The Cubs, of all people, were in the World Series in 1945. Musial was in the Navy. 1946, Musial comes back. He's 24 years old. And while I believe that everyone maybe in Illinois you're either a Cubs fan or a Cardinals fan. I was a Cardinals fan, grew up listening to Harry Carey every night. My mother was a Cubs fan because the Cubs were playing all day games then. She listened to Bert Wilson on the radio. I listened to Harry Carey every night. So this is a book that I should have done 30 years ago, when people were still alive. Everybody that I'm writing about now in this book are gone, including Musial. So I've decided to do it. It's kind of a slice of Musial's life. 1946, the Dodgers and Cardinals in the pennant race, the Cardinals and the Red Sox in the World Series. Enos Slaughter scores from first base on a single to win the World Series in a Game 7. Musial hits 365. St. Louis is the fourth largest city in the United States. The National League is all of baseball extends from St. Louis to Boston. Nobody's west of St. Louis. Nobody's south of St. Louis. It's a small footprint of Major League Baseball. 16 teams in 10 cities, only 10 cities. St. Louis had 2, Philadelphia had 2, New York had 3, Chicago had 2. So it's a small, it's baseball that a lot of old people, will understand as the game that they grew up knowing, and I hope that young people, my theory that I've sold the book to my agent with is that everybody who's a Cardinal fan knows Stan Musial's name. They know he was a great player, but they don't know anything about how he did it, how he got there, where he came from. He came from Denora, Pennsylvania. First job was in Williamson, West Virginia. And I'm going to kind of the working title for the book is Becoming Stan the Man. I've even found the newspaper story where Bob Bragg, the longtime sports writer in St. Louis at the Post-Dispatch, Bob Bragg was a rookie in 1946, his first year covering the Cardinals. And at Ebbets Field in September of 1946, he heard somebody in the stands saying, "Here comes that man." Musial was killing the Dodgers every time they went to Ebbets Field. And Bragg asked a guy next to him, what are they saying? That man? And the friend said, no, they're saying, "Here comes the man." And so Bragg wrote a column on the train going from Ebbets Field to Chicago for the next series about hearing that and that was the beginning of Stan the Man, the nickname. And so that was, it's archival research that I'm going to make into a story about America in 46 and Musial becoming Stan the Man.
Well, Dave, having read your writing, I am sure
I'm excited
it is
about it because it's fun.
I'm sure it is going to be interesting. I mean, you cannot write a dull sentence. So I definitely look forward to reading that. And I just want to say to our audience, I really would strongly recommend this book, My Home Team. I mean, it's a delightful, fun, inspiring, touching read that that will stay with you for a long time. So I really urge you to pick up that book. Dave, it's been a delight to talk. I look forward to meeting in person. I mean, the next time I'm in Central Illinois, I'll give you a little advance notice and maybe we can connect in Morton or East Peoria or something like that, because I'd love to meet you in person and continue this conversation.
That would be fun, John. Please do that. Try to come sometime in the winter, although winter can be hard, as you know, but we'd get to see a basketball game.
That would be fun. Thank you so much, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for watching another edition of our series, Illinois Authors. We'll have the video of this interview on our website in the coming days. Please show it to family and friends. And thank you for supporting the Institute and keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.